So good morning and welcome. We are so pleased to be able to offer this program this morning, and the person responsible for making the connection is our very own Babette Sanders. And so I would like to turn it over to Babette to introduce and to help us welcome.
It's what a treat to be able to introduce today's speakers. Julia Mayer is my cousin, and she has even been to Temple Jeremiah. So it's a nice family connection today. And we're especially fortunate to have not only Julia Mayer, the author of Painting Resilience here, but also Fred Terna, whose story as an artist and a Holocaust survivor Julia has so poignantly documented in her book. I would not ordinarily mention the names or the ages of our speakers, but in this case, it's a significant element of an intergenerational partnership. Julia is 31 and Fred is 97, which is wonderful. Their mutual goal in undertaking this project is to carry Fred's story, his unique coping mechanisms, and his hope to new generations. In addition to being the author of this beautiful book, and you'll soon see some of Fred's works that are included, Julia, in her day job, is the director of development at Year Up, a Boston-based nonprofit that teaches business skills and provides workforce training and brings internship and job opportunities to underserved, talented young adults. Even as a child, Tikkun Olam was a part of Julia's life. I want to mention before we get started that all of Julia's proceeds from the sale of Painting Resilience go to the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, which has the largest collection of Fred's work. I also want to mention that both Julia and Fred have donated their time for today's presentation. So with that introduction, here's Julia.
Thank you, Babette. It's so great to be here and to join all of you this morning. Thank you so much for signing on to join us, especially to my wonderful cousin Babette for making this introduction and for that lovely intro to start, and Rabbi Cohen for organizing along with Phyllis Berg, all hosting me here today. So thank you. Over the course of this morning, you'll hear a few small sections of Painting Resilience, a little bit from the man himself, Fred Terna, and have a chance to ask some of your questions of both him and me. You can feel free to enter questions in the chat as we go along, or if you'd like to send them privately, Rabbi Cohen is going to be moderating the Q&A later, so you can send them directly to Rabbi Cohen. If you'd like to learn more about the book or Fred's art while we're talking, you can find information on both on my website, which is www.juliamayer.com. I'd like to share a little bit of the book with you now. One of the first questions I always get asked is how this project got started. And so to answer that, a bit like Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, we'll begin at the beginning with the introduction. Fred Terna has been a fixture at my family's holiday table and at our synagogue on Saturday mornings for most of my life. Growing up, I knew he was a full-time artist, but did not know he had been painting for more than 60 years. I didn't realize that his work was frequently shown in galleries throughout New York City, either solo or grouped with other post-impressionist artists, or that his work is in many major Holocaust museums around the world, including the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in DC and Yad Vashem in Jerusalem. Fred and his wife of over 30 years, Rebecca, often spend two of our larger family holidays with us, Passover and Rosh Hashanah. Rebecca commands an audience while Fred is reserved. My mom maintains that there is an unwritten agreement that if Fred talks, everyone listens. Naturally soft-spoken with a Central European accent from his native Prague, Fred is sometimes willing and able to tell stories about his past. Other times, he's not. It's something he's honest about, and I learned to check when he arrived. Can I ask questions tonight? Are you up for talking tonight? I never needed to clarify that what I really meant was, can I ask about the Holocaust tonight? Starting when I was a teenager, Fred, then in his 80s, offered to take me on tours of his art studio in Brooklyn. A savvy New York City kid, I had a pretty specific idea of what it meant when an older man asked a teenage girl to tour his studio. And after years of asking, he eventually gave up. I was a recent college graduate when it occurred to me to ask Fred if his offer of a tour still stood. He readily agreed. I was living in Boston and working for nonprofits I cared about deeply. I had a serious boyfriend, Brian. Brian's grandfather survived World War II in hiding, and his grandmother had escaped, but was the secret keeper of many others' stories that she never shared. I now wear the diamond that his grandfather took into hiding with him during the war, and which he gave to Brian's grandmother when he proposed. My own grandparents fled Germany in 1935 and 1940. Many of those they left behind perished. My grandfather died before I was born, and my grandmother was so overwhelmed by guilt, remorse, and sadness that she kept much of her history to herself. My grandfather, on the other side, was part of a division of the American Army that liberated a concentration camp called Alam. He spoke to me about it only once, but for the rest of his life, he said Kaddish for those he buried in a mass grave that day. For Brian, my older brother Jesse, and me, the idea of spending the afternoon with someone who could talk about his experiences was a special one. I scheduled a tour when all three of us would be in Brooklyn. On a brisk sunny day in February 2014, Brian, Jesse, and I managed to find a parking spot right across the street from Fred and Rebecca's 4-story Brooklyn brownstone. Rebecca, 23 years younger than Fred, was away skiing. Fred welcomed us. In the entryway was a beautiful painting made of short pastel lines on a long light canvas. I complimented it, and Fred thanked me and told us this was how he remembered one of the mass graves from his time in the camps. Fred walked us through the artwork on his walls, and currently in progress in his studio, and gave a short demonstration of how he mixes acrylic paints. One of us asked if we could keep asking questions, and Fred agreed. We sat with him in his studio, a large, bright room on the top floor filled to the brim with art supplies, labeled notebooks of Fred's work, slides, photographs, works in progress, and much more. We asked questions, and Fred answered. Instead of asking about the war, falsely thinking we knew that story already, we talked about his life afterwards, about what happened after liberation, about living with the trauma he had experienced. With prodding, Fred opened glimpses into his life, snippets of time after liberation. He also told us an abbreviated story of the night of his liberation, a shocking tale built on coincidence after coincidence that allowed him to survive a night few would. Fred said that after his liberation, he moved back to Prague where he had grown up. I couldn't understand it. How does one go from near death in a concentration camp to regular daily life in Prague? I pressed him on it, and he insisted the story wasn't interesting and politely declined to answer my questions. It's in that moment that this book was born. Fred spent his late teen years and early 20s in concentration camps. After a year in hiding, he was sent to Lipa, his first concentration camp, at 17 years old. Lipa was a labor camp filled with able-bodied young men, much like Fred. And from there, he spent over a year in Terezin, as it is called in Czech, or as you may know it, Theresienstadt, an overcrowded work camp that the Nazis called a walled ghetto. He was transported from there to Auschwitz for a brief time, then to his final camp, Kaufering, which was a sub-camp of the extremely hard labor and death camp Dachau. Fred barely survived his 6 months there, only just making it to April 27th, 1945, the day of his liberation. Almost 4 years in camps and almost 6 years from when he went into hiding until when he returned home. But 6 years of what is so far a 97-year life. The anniversary of Fred's liberation is just 2 days from today. Over the course of working on this book and of hearing more of Fred's story, I came to understand more of the symbolism seen throughout Fred's work. Personally, I just love his art. You can see one of his pieces hanging behind me here at home. Move out of the way. This is Resilience, which is actually the namesake of this project. As we went through the interview process each day, we would sometimes hit walls where things were just too dark for me, Fred, or both of us. Usually me, I was usually the problem in this, to keep going. And we just needed a break. Going through Fred's art archive became how we took those breaks together while staying on task. Sometimes we would go into his storage area and pick a piece or a series of pieces at random. Sometimes Fred had a specific piece he wanted to show me. Sometimes I wanted to go back to a specific piece, thinking I understood a little bit more about it now. So with that in mind, I'd like to share a few of Fred's pieces with you today. There are about 24 throughout Painting Resilience, which is a sample of the thousands of pieces that Fred has created over his lifetime. And I'm going to focus in on just a few this morning, which have some of the most commonly recurring themes of his work. So we'll pull up the first now. This is an India ink drawing that Fred actually created while he was in Terezin. It's one of the earliest of his existing works, and it depicts a mental hospital or institution that was in the camp. Art for Fred at this point was really a means of escape. It was a way of having control over something in a lifetime where he'd had control over almost nothing. Even if that control was just over a white piece of paper and what you would see on it. So he drew what he saw whenever he could get his hands on materials. And that's something that either here I can talk a little bit more about as we get later into the program. These very early works are still held by Kibbutz Givat Chaim Ehud in Israel and some by the Ghetto Fighters Museum. We're the ones who helped Fred find and identify them again after the war. This next piece is almost 40 years later, titled Face to Face, and it has a lot of the symbolism that you see throughout Fred's work. Much of the sort of top 2/3 is taken up by flames, but it's also shaped as a menorah, which is something that you see over and over in Fred's works. There are a lot of circles. There's one almost right in the center of the canvas, and some that the flames are disrupting. Circles have a lot of different meanings in Fred's work. Sometimes they're happy. They can symbolize wholeness, the womb, safety, someone caring for you. And sometimes they can symbolize an inability to get out, being stuck, having nowhere to go. At the bottom of this piece, you can see, and you may need to even lean into your screen to do it, a couple embracing. And on the left-hand side, a face looking on. Fred was actually in Terezin with, among others, the woman who would become his first wife, Stella. And the two of them were often embracing with somebody else looking on. Moving on to the next one, this is the only piece that I'll show today that's not included in the book. You probably noticed that the first couple of pieces, and you'll certainly notice with the next ones now that you've seen this one, were photographed really well. Fred's son, Daniel Terna, is a photographer, incredibly talented in his own right, and lent us his talents in capturing Fred's work to include in this book. This particular piece was already gone by the time we were acquired by the US Holocaust Memorial Museum, but no longer in the house by the time we were capturing the work to be included in the book. And so Daniel could not get a high enough resolution image, but it's a piece that I really think is important. And so it's one I wanted to talk a little bit about today. The subject of this piece, Engraved Field, is what Fred says he remembers after 1 year in the camps when it was too cold to dig full graves for all of those who died. And so as the snow started melting in the spring, all of the bones of the dead started floating back up to the surface of the ground. And this is what Fred remembers that looking like. You can see that there's a good amount of texture in this piece. He's used small sticks and stones and sand. This is something that's in a lot of his work. for I think a couple of reasons. One, much of Fred's earliest work was done in dirt. It was using a stick to draw out what he was seeing in front of him in the ground, so that when a guard walked by, he could quickly kick the dirt over and they wouldn't know what he had been doing. The texture becomes really critical to a lot of the pieces that he creates over time. And there was actually a series of works that he created where each piece had, each color had a different texture mixed into it. So you could make out the total work just by feel. And he was invited to do a show for the blind so that they could experience his artwork in the way that those who are seeing can. The first time that Fred pulled out one of his textured pieces, when Brian, my brother Jesse, and I were visiting, he dragged his nails down the front of it, and we were aghast, like, you can't treat art that way. And Fred said, no, you can't do it at a museum, but it's my work, and I know the quality of my work, and nothing I do is going to hurt it. And so texture is something that you see come out in a lot of his works, including the one that he has behind him today. For a real change of pace, we'll move on to one of Fred's prints. This is an orange owl. Painting really became a form of mental health for Fred and for his wife, Stella, his first wife, in more ways than one. It certainly helped to get the things that he was thinking and feeling and remembering out onto canvas so that he didn't have to only experience them internally. But at one point, Fred's first wife, Stella, became so ill from her own experiences in the camps that she was suicidal, and Fred was afraid to leave her home alone. And so he created a mechanism. So that's when he quit his job and became a full-time artist. It was so that he could do something at home with her all day. And during that time, he created a mechanism for making prints together that took 4 hands. So it took the 2 of them, one hand on each corner of the piece, to press each piece just so that the colors would come out right. And that gave them something to do every day. It both gave them something to focus on, something to think about, and at the end of the day, something that they could sell to pay their bills. And that really became a way that they cared for each other through that time. A lot of Fred's work is, you can see symbolism of the camps. The owls, I think, are a great example of some of his more commercial work. Fred was in a gallery showing a couple of his pieces to a gallery owner, and the owner got distracted and wandered off to talk to someone, and he had a 3-year-old daughter who was running around the gallery while Fred was there, and Fred called her over and said, "Hey, what's your favorite animal?" And she said, "Owls." So he drew her an owl, and she said, "Another one." So he drew her another one, and she said, "Another one." And by then the gallery owner had come back over and was looking over Fred's shoulder and said, "You can't give these to her, we could sell these." And he convinced Fred to do a full show of just owls. The show sold out. So he got Fred to do a second show of just owls, and the show sold out. He asked Fred to do a third show of just owls, and Fred became afraid he would become that guy who paints owls, and declined so that he could get back to the work that he really felt was meaningful in making. Despite that, a lot of Fred's friends at this point still think that owls are his favorite animal and have given him owl stuffed animals, owl pictures, owl paintings, and he and his second wife, his current wife, love of his life, Rebecca, have a whole wall in their dining room of owl memorabilia that's been given to them. We'll look at one final piece together for right now. This one is called Open Gates. And I'm actually going to read the description from the book because there's so much going on that I don't want to forget anything. Walls appear in many of Fred's paintings. Even though they're not always the focal point, they never fully vanish. He explains, at some point in my work, I put gates in the walls so that you could actually get somewhere. But then the gates started to look like fences around the camps. Here, Fred paints the Temple Mount, a topic he returns to over and over throughout his career in different ways. In this version, streaming sunlight illuminates darkened archways. The short strokes are similar to the technique he uses in other paintings to create flames, but with this blue and yellow color scheme, they seem joyous instead of sinister. These arches symbolize different things at different times: new beginnings, tombstones, escape routes. This is just a sample of a few of Fred's works. He's also created masks, stained glass for a few different synagogues, and thousands of other paintings and prints. This book is not a complete catalog of his art by any means. It's a way of learning more about his life through his artwork. And Fred, being 97 years old, I think maybe having a little snooze first thing this morning. So I'm not sure if we're going to welcome Fred to join me for some Q&A right now. I think everyone can be pretty understanding, and perhaps we'll give him a few minutes until he comes back online. One of the questions that I already see in the chat window is how he saved the pictures that he did in the concentration camps. And I'm happy to talk a little bit about that to get us started. When Fred was in Terezin, it actually wasn't so easy to create works to begin with. There was a drafting office in Terezin. The Nazis were using that space, the prisoners that they had there, to create propaganda to use throughout the war. So there was more material around, more paper and ink than might have been in other camps. And occasionally, Fred's description to me was that they found it was a bit of an honor to steal from the Nazis. And so sometimes they were able to get their hands on paper or some ink in order to create new works.
Hello?
Hi, Fred.
Yes.
We could probably hear both sides of that conversation if we wanted to. So when Fred was moved from Terezin to Auschwitz, he took the remaining works that he had, put them in a box, which was hidden under a loose stone in the floorboards, and gave them to Stella, the woman who had become his first wife. Stella was shipped to Auschwitz shortly after Fred was, and she gave them to someone who gave them to someone. And many, many years later, in 1983, Fred and Rebecca, his current wife, were on their honeymoon in Israel, and they had heard that there was a kibbutz that had some of the work from Terezin, and they thought maybe they'll know where they could find some of these works. And so they went to visit the kibbutz. And they said, well, we don't know anything about those specific works, but we do have a box of unidentified artwork that has been here, and you're welcome to look through it. And they did, and 6 of Fred's pieces were in that box. He decided after all that to let the kibbutz keep them and continue to show them, because maintaining that experience, maintaining what had happened and being able to show others was the most important thing even then. And so Fred, I'm going to ask you if you're up for a couple of questions now, and then we can ask the audience to share some questions as well. How does that sound?
All right, with me.
All right. So Fred, the first thing that I'd love to ask you, you picked a particular piece, which I know you just finished, to have with you today. Is there anything that you can share with us about the work that you have next to you?
Like most of my work, I'm not frozen in one style or one form. I use art as a relief as a escape. It's rather shamelessly dealing with what troubles me. That is, whenever I need to express feelings, paintings are the way for me to do it. Every now and then, there are happy ones, as like the one behind you, or the one to my left, this one, which is dealing with memories rather than depicting something specific. That is, I'm not an illustrator. I use art shamelessly as a kind of a therapy. If something bothers me, it goes onto a canvas. But alternatively, I feel very good. That's a way to express myself.
Thank you. So, Fred, can I ask you, we worked on this project for a long time. It took us many hours of interviews and years of sort of continued conversation. And I think you knew going into it that it wasn't going to be something that we did quickly or, overnight. Why did you say yes to my doing this? Both why in general do you say yes to interviews, but also why to me to doing this larger scale project?
From soon after liberation, I was told, write your story. And I realized very quickly that I really couldn't do it. To immerse myself into some of the memories was more than I could do. And well into recent years, last 40, 50 years after the war, when I met Julia, I felt comfortable enough to talk about it. And when Julia insisted to write this story, I said, yes, I will talk. So this is how the book actually got generated, not as a continuous narrative of what happened in my life, but as an illustration of this and that feeling. And to this day, painting has a different place in my life. Yes, it is my livelihood, but that's a sideline. The important thing is it gives me a mode of expressing myself, of saying things that I could not possibly put into words.
Well, to that end, can you talk a little bit about your creative process? How do you come up with new pieces? And when you do, how do you get started on them?
I like to tell the story that when I have a blank canvas in front of me, I stand in front of it with my back to the canvas. And in my hand is a brush with some paint in it. And I sort of reach back and make some lines. That is, break the whiteness of the canvas. And then looking back at it, I said, what is it that I was doing? And that tends to be a beginning of a painting. And I never know what it is going to be. My next canvas, I have no idea what it is going to be. Sort of very vague ideas these days. But creativity is a strange thing. I don't really understand it. But it is a mode of living for me. And I'm very fortunate to have that.
Absolutely. And we're fortunate to get to see the outcomes of it. So thank you. Fred, usually when you speak, and I've heard you speak on your story a number of times, you try to identify the youngest person in the audience and ask them to remember that they met a survivor today. And so with that framing, I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about what you hope readers will take from this story. What do you hope people will do knowing more about what happened to you and your experiences?
I've been talking about my experiences during the war for a long, long time. I'm part of the Speakers Bureau of the Museum of Jewish Heritage here. And I'm I used to speak to audiences of a class, sometimes as many as 200-300 people. When I try what I'm trying to tell people, perhaps in that many words, that yes, I had a very, very difficult past part of it, and yet somehow I managed to live with it, to think about it, to derive from it ideas, to measure what was going on around me. In a way, the events of the day in my mind get filtered through the past. My answer to specific questions tends to be involved. That is, you cannot just stand by and let things happen. The way I am involved is reminding people of the dangers of not being involved. I feel that a lot of things would have happened quite differently in my family. It would have been alive if enough people around them were involved and willing to assert themselves. So what I'm trying to tell younger people is be involved.
Absolutely. Thank you. And I think with that, I'd like to welcome Rabbi Cohen. If you have questions, if folks want to send questions directly, you can direct message them to Rabbi Cohen, and I'll ask you to moderate a little bit. You're welcome to direct questions to Fred, to me, or to both of us, as you wish, as you're interested in.
Thank you, Julia, and thank you, Fred. We're so blessed to have both of you here and to share in the story and the creativity and the art and the message as well. There are quite a few young people, and I'm going to have people self-identify young because I don't want to get into any trouble here. But there are quite a few young people, and I understand that you wrote a novel, Julia, when you were just 16 years old. And I wonder how that came about and then how that prepared you for this work that you've done with Fred.
Yeah, thank you. I wrote my first book when I was 16. I did a summer novel writing program with an organization called 826, which actually I believe has a Chicago chapter as well as a New York chapter, that was doing specifically a novel writing program for public high school teens in New York. And that book was, I had been writing short stories for most of the time since I've been able to write. And my dad always says, your short stories are really outlines for longer books. And I think I saw that there was an application due for this novel writing program, which required the first 2 chapters with the application, something like maybe a week before the application was due. So I needed an idea that already existed. And so I went back through my short stories and picked one that I really loved and spent the summer writing that book. And what that did, I think, in addition to showing me that I could do that I could do a longer form writing, that particularly age didn't matter, that coming into it, knowing how it would end didn't matter, or knowing what the exact product would look like. It also built some structure for me in how I write. For that summer, we were required to complete, I think it was 1 chapter a week. Maybe it was 2 chapters a week, each 7 to 8 pages. And you can actually see in the structure of my first book that like every chapter, there are exactly as many chapters as weeks of that summer. And every chapter is exactly 7 to 8 pages long, because that was sort of the structure of how I wrote. And that did, I think, a lot to teach me about how to outline, how to pull things together, how to look at the book from different perspectives, and how to take criticism on it, because the first draft of that book is by no means the book that was published on its own about 5 years later. And that's the same of Painting Resilience. It took me a while to figure out what the structure would look like. In the video, you saw the outline that I created of multicolored Post-it notes that told me sort of what I was looking at. And once I had that structure, it was about sticking to it, especially as somebody who worked full time, and ensuring that I was really putting the time into it on a regular, consistent basis, and being open to criticism and open to changing it to make it the work that you now see in front of you.
Thank you. I wanted to mention also, there were a number of people who had trouble getting onto this Zoom link, and I apologize for that. The technology is fantastic when it works and very frustrating when it doesn't. We have a recording of this, so that if you miss the first section and the reference to the outline from the video that Julia just mentioned, you'll be able to access that as well. So you'll catch up to where we are in the moment. Again, I'm so sorry for the frustration of not being able to get on in time. Fred, you talked a little bit, and maybe you can elaborate, and Julia mentioned this a little bit as well, is, how did you get the materials eventually to be able to create these works while you were in the camp?
Well, I started to work right after the war and made drawings and small watercolors of memories, and it included concentration camp, the chimney, scenes that were very much in my mind. It didn't take me long. When I looked at it, I said, wait a minute, I'm out of the camp. I don't have to be there anymore. And I switched, painted landscapes, painted pretty scenes. And looking back then, now I'm looking backward, I realized that even the landscapes had fences, walls, enclosures in them. And it eventually dawned on me, I've got to deal with it. It's not going to go away. And that is pretty much the motive now in my paintings. Yes, these things are on my mind. The feelings are on my mind. The memories are in my mind. And I better deal with it. And I found that painting them away is it's a wrong word, painting them away, but putting them on canvas, that is, allowing my feelings to come out, was really a very positive thing. And I'm continuing to do that. And very fortunately, it allows me to draw also on happy situations. That is, painting is my mode of expressing my feelings, my attitudes, and I'm involved in the world around me by way of painting. That is, I'm a mirror of sorts for the events around me. And I don't have to tell you about recent events. We went through a stretch of very miserable times, but here I'm out of it and I'm painting happy paintings again.
Thank you, thank you. And maybe
this one,
yeah.
That one, no? Happy kind.
Yeah. You had talked about that as part of your process, Fred, that when you have the blank canvas, you actually turn your back to the canvas, yes, and with a brush in your hand. And then I'm wondering, when you turn back around to the blank canvas, what do you see there? How do you translate from that backwards to the forwards?
I really don't know. I see markings on the canvas, and say, what did my mind, my brush do behind my back? And does it tell me something? I usually get some idea out of that, but again, very much in tune with what I'm feeling. I may feel that what I painted was one way, but I'm painting it in a different way. That is, I'm a professional of sorts. That is, professional in being able to express myself and go from a gloomy painting to a happy one. and I know how to go about it. Very fortunately, I have the emotional equipment. Perhaps in a minor degree, the intellectual one, awareness of what I'm doing and its place within my life and also in the life of those around me. I'm involved. I'm involved in the shul. I'm involved in communities. I'm part of the museum speakers bureau. So to keep living within my memories, and I think that is the main skill that I've acquired, to live with my memories, to lead after all the years, and some of them were not happy ones, but I'm able to live with it. So that perhaps is a skill that for which I take some credit.
So there was a question that came through, Fred. Have you had any formal art training?
Minimal one, but that doesn't mean that I wasn't involved. I know a lot about painting technology from the way old masters and even earlier centuries painted. So I'm very much aware of the technology of painting, the very act of putting something on a flat surface. I'm painting in acrylics. I mix my own, and I know why I'm doing that. I know what goes into my paintings. Every now and then, when people come to my studio, they sort of go like that and sketch a painting and say, don't do that in a museum. They don't like it. I'm comfortable doing it with my own paintings, since I know how well they are constructed physically. The mental part, that's not for me to decide, but it's a good, solid work of art.
One of the things I would add, Rabbi, is that in addition to painting his own canvases, Fred also stretches and primes his own canvas. So really sees the piece from the very, very beginning to end. So talk about knowing the construction of the work that you're creating. He is creating it truly from the start.
So apropos, continuing in that same vein, how do you, what goes into choosing the colors that you start with?
Oh, I don't know. In front of me are jars with dry pigments, and sort of, I think my hand remembers things that I've long since forgotten. I mix things the same as adding acrylic, adding this or that ingredient to make a durable and reasonably pleasant surface. I'm a technician in many ways. I'm a craftsman. A good part of me is just the craft of painting. Yes, I'm trying to add something to that craft, but being involved also means being involved in technology. I go to a museum, I get very, very close to look at the brush strokes. How well is a paint applied to it? So it is a full involvement, not just a visual one, but involvement in the creation of that thing. And that's a little bit of my lifestyle, looking closely and deriving some lesson from it, if there is one. But I do not just paint it. Painting becomes a larger involvement. Involvement even when talking to a larger group of people or having a group in the studio live. Unfortunately, these days, this is somewhat limited. But being involved in not just the content, but the process of making a thing, including its technology. Well, it's a sort of says something about my lifestyle rather than about painting.
Thank you. Thank you. Julie, our question came in, and I'd like to add it as the beginning of another question, just in terms of the process of organizing all the information, the time that you spent with Fred together. And I'm going to add, if you could again, how did this all come about, right? How did, again, if you just say a few words about how the connection developed, and then that process of bringing all this together, and maybe even you and Fred can talk about the choice of which paintings to include in the book out of the thousands of pieces that have been created over a lifetime.
Absolutely. So this book came about really out of a tour that Fred gave me and my husband, Brian, who's been kindly doing all of the screen sharing for us this morning, and my brother, Jesse, of his studio, and talking through some of the symbolism in his artwork. And I initially actually wrote a letter. I left that day, and I think the drive between Fred's house and my parents' house is about, 15 minutes or so. And by the time I got home, I walked in the door and said, I think I want to write this book. And I wrote Fred a letter because I was concerned about just springing it on you on the phone or in person, and Fred feeling pressured to say yes when I knew this was a pretty big project. So I took a couple of weeks to work on this letter, suggesting maybe that Fred would write the book and I could do research for him, or I could write some of it and he could, whatever would work, we would find a way. And mailed it and was very nervous for a couple of days. And Fred called me as soon as he got the letter and said that he liked the idea. He wanted to consult with his wife and his son to make sure that they were comfortable with it. And that he would prefer that I take on the writing and he would share the story with me, and then it would be mine to write. At the end of the phone call, to Fred's comment about staying involved in technology, Fred said, I've also found that email is rather a faster means of communication than handwritten letters. So perhaps we could email each other going forward, which we did. And got an email from Fred not too long after saying that he was ready, had Rebecca and Daniel's permission and was ready to move ahead with this. And that summer, at the time I was working in an elementary school, and though I was administrative, so I didn't get the whole summer off, it was much easier to take time during the summer. I came into New York for 2 weeks, and Fred and I spent basically full time, 9 to 5, 8 to 4 every day, doing these interviews. And I asked a lot of questions, and Fred answered most of them, all of them, I think, or distracted me enough that I forgot that I had asked the question. And I recorded those interviews. So I took a lot of notes while we talked because I found that was helpful, but I recorded the interviews as well. And I sort of did an initial run through where I not quite fully transcribed, but almost transcribed the interviews that we had done. Was completely overwhelmed for about 6 months by how much material I had, and kind of sat there not knowing what to do. And I'm actually going to try while we're talking to pull up a timeline to share with you, just so I can share my screen and you can see what I'm talking about. But I wound up sort of pulling out what are each of the stories that I really feel like need to be shared, need to be told, and put each of those stories onto its own Post-it note. And I'm actually going to ask if you can pull up the timeline in the media library to share with folks. Thank you. My husband is right over there in the room, but has his mic muted, so hopefully that's not too distracting. So put a Post-it note with each of the stories that I wanted to make sure was included, and pulled those out on a timeline so that I could see really what I wanted to be sure was there. And within that sort of came out that his artwork was a huge part of the timeline, not necessarily in order, because there are many years that there's no specific piece for, But this is the timeline. These are the Post-it notes now taped because they were moved around so many times. With green being stories that happened after the war, yellow things that happened during the war, and then the pink are pieces of art that I felt were relevant to that particular set of stories. And so that could be because that piece, most of Fred's work, with the exception of what was done in Terezin, is not illustrations. It's symbolic, it's abstract. And so it could be that there was symbolism in it that I thought was relevant to that particular time in his life. Or it could be that it is something he painted at a particular time. But I tried to really make sure that we were capturing the broad range of Fred's work, which is huge. There's so much to go through, and have at least some sampling of all of his types of pieces. But I certainly hope that one day there will be a full catalog of his work, because I would love it. For the moment, I wanted to make sure there was at least a sample of all of the types of work that he did. Fred used to take pictures, well, slides originally, then pictures, just low quality ones of each piece when it was finished. And he let me pull them off of his hard drive on a thumb drive. So I actually have his full catalog that I can go through. And then Daniel, Fred's son, captured the works that I chose in higher quality so that you could all actually see and experience and enjoy them in a way that photos that I would have taken with my phone or that Fred took when he was finished with the work didn't quite capture.
Thank you. So two more questions. The first is it, somebody asked, how is it possible to buy one of Fred's works? Are they for sale? Are they, how are they in a gallery? How might one do that? And then another person asked, so we'd love to know that. Another person asked, they saw one of your pieces, Fred, that's called the Fiddle. And they wanted to know a little bit more about that particular painting of the Fiddle.
I really don't know which painting you're referring to, but the Fiddle is really a word that expresses what painting is for me. That is inside, and Julia mentions it in her superb writing, that painting is a reflection of what I'm feeling. And that is not often, or quite frequently, very difficult. And painting has become one of my ways of escaping those difficult moments or stretches of time. And Julia uses the word painting, and I know I mentioned it somewhere, I said, Julia, painting is my fiddle. Inside of me, there's a nasty, nasty bass player. I have no control over that bass player. But I've learned over the years to play the fiddle above it so that there should be some harmony to my life. And that is where the word fiddle comes in. And maybe there probably are paintings. There is probably a painting called the Fiddle, but it is an expression of my way of having a tool to escape things that bother me. That is, I can live because of having found a fiddle. And I think this may be the moment to say thank you to Julia. Without her nudging and being involved, I'd probably be in a worse shape. But I'm in a good shape, and Julia deserves a lot of praise for it. I'm very fortunate to have met her family and her, and that goes back now many, many years.
Thank you, Fred. And the feeling is more than mutual, I think you know. I'll notice that Fred will never answer the question about where you can buy his work or how you can find out more about it. But you'll see in the chat window, he does have a website, frederickterna.com. And if you're interested in inquiring about a particular piece, you can email his son, Daniel, at studio@fredterna.com. Thank you, Brian, for putting that in. And thank you, Fred, for your faith in doing this with me. It was a long process, I think longer than either of us expected when we started, but a pleasure to come to an outcome that we're both pleased with. Rabbi, if I may, I'd love to do one closing sort of brief reading, which I think fits really well with what Fred was just sharing, of finding that fiddle to play over. And then I'll pass it back to you to close us out. It's not an uncommon sentiment for Holocaust survivors to believe that their own survival was luck. Having heard his story in such depth, I agree that Fred's physical survival is almost entirely coincidental, though arguably his certainty that he could survive and insistence on continued learning to plan for the future provided necessary mental and emotional fortitude. The memories of the war and the trauma he experienced never go away, despite his belief in the hospital bed following liberation that he would eventually be able to move on. The vestiges are still there more than 7 decades later. Fred keeps extra pairs of shoes in case emergency strikes. He freezes up in front of police officers, momentarily finding himself someplace where the appearance of a guard might mean torture or death. He somehow allows these moments to pass, pulling himself back into the present. He never learns to forget the trauma. He learns to live with it, and even to create beauty out of it through his artwork. This left me with important questions that would not allow the book to end after Fred's liberation, despite how much less vivid his memories are at that point. If living with is what takes skill, what are those skills? How does one develop their own internal fiddle to play over the ugly tune of traumatic memories that can never be escaped? And so with that, I thank all of you for joining. Thank you again, Babette and Rabbi Cohen, for hosting us today and introducing me. And thank you, Fred, for being with us here and always being willing to answer my questions.
Thank you for having me participate in this.
Thank you. And we thank you so much for this opportunity. We are in your debt and in Babette's as well for making the initial connection. And again, I apologize for the technology glitch. Please make sure to check out Julia's website, juliamayer.com. It's been posted a couple of different times. And Frederick Terna.com to see the paintings, and those links are there, and we'll continue to have those pieces available, that information available through the temple, and a recording will be available as well. Thank you so much, and we're just deeply appreciative.
Thank you.
Thank you. Have a good rest of the day, everyone. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.